Hi. In addition to being your moderator, I am going to give a talk about some research that I did with undergraduates on electoral districting. And so the context here is that UW-T, University of Washington, Tacoma, and the University of Puget Sound, which are two universities in Tacoma, have an NSF-REU site that is sits between sort of geography and cartography and mathematics and computer science. So the senior personnel are on the PI. There's a mathematician, Courtney Thatcher, my partner, who is the co-PI. There's a Christine Jones with Microsoft, and David Rutchless, who might even be in this room, is the other geographer. And so over the summer, we got 12 students and their giant John Cena doll, and that's on the shoulders up there, to stay on the University of Puget Sound, live together, and basically work full-time designing projects and studying electoral districting. And so as much as I love presenting my own work, I'm actually presenting their work today. I think it's important to start with just sort of this basic observation that if you consider the fact that you're drawing lines on a map and you're deciding who's included and who's not, who counts and who doesn't, then you can make the argument pretty easily that all districting is gerrymandering. And I think we also know it's really important that mapping time is hard. Like, it's difficult to do. Here's a famous image from David Harvey, Timespace Compression, right? We start and people can move around by like ship and then locomotives and jet airplanes. And while this is an off-cited and really famous image, particularly in kind of sort of older Marxist geography, it's also just not true, right? Certainly people can travel faster once there's airplanes, assuming that they, have the right passport and the ability to purchase an airline ticket, and that they want to go somewhere where the airline is traveling. Time-space compression is not actually evenly felt, and it's particularly often felt hardest by people in sort of non-dominant positions. So here is an attempt to draw an early isochrone of Seattle, downtown traffic. And the reason that I'm showing it is because instead of sort of drawing lines on the map of how far things are, it instead actually bends and folds the map, the underlying geography itself. This is from Bill Bunge's dissertation, actually. So why does that matter for districting, you might be thinking? Get to the point, Jim. Well, it turns out we're going to have a little history lesson about districting in Washington. Way back at the end of the 60s, the legislature in Washington could not agree on drawing their districts. And so Richard Morrill, professor at the University of Washington, Seattle, was appointed as a special master. And this is a really neat title that courts actually appoint sometimes. My dream in life is to someday be a special master. But that's not true. But he drew our districts in 1972. He sat, you can read these great old newspaper articles like "The Master at His Craft" in like the Seattle Times and stuff. And this is what he comes up with. And he published very extensively about what his process was and what he considered and how he did it. But then in '76, he revisits his redistricting. And what he does is he takes an algorithm that estimates travel time from all points to all points. And so he then tries to draw districts that minimize travel time across them. In other words, what he is trying to emphasize here is the idea that you are likely part of a community that you can actually travel to. And where this gets complicated is because it's all points to all points, and that's a relatively complicated computational process. So another neat part about it is that the algorithms he actually used are lost. They were published in this weird journal that I cannot find a copy of. Perhaps I should talk to some librarians, but I have tried. So we wanted to try and redo that. This is our first attempt. We threw a lattice over Washington of points. This is one of my master's students, actually part of the project sitting in the audience. And what we did is we hit, this was using Bing actually, because we got some support from Microsoft. And we just threw 2 points in and we got the estimated travel time in seconds from every point to every point in Washington state. We then used, so you end up with a distance matrix that roughly looks like that. If you see that line going diagonally from the top left to the lower right, that's a point mapping to itself. So the distance time returned is 0. We then did something called multidimensional scaling. This is actually a 3-dimensional MDS, although you can choose your dimensionality based on, there's some ways to do it. This is Western Washington's congressional district. And so if you, oh, I'm sorry. So, oh, fine. So does anybody want to guess what that giant circle that emerges if you, so what the MDS does is it pulls all the points that are close to each other that are easier to travel between, and it pulls them together. And it pushes apart areas that are hard to travel. This is a really beautiful and obvious result because if you know the topography of Western Washington, that giant circle is Olympic National Park. So immediately from this, we see that there are spokes around the park, but people don't tend to travel across or through the park, despite the fact that they've been districted together there. So then this summer, we wanted to look at Ohio. And the reason we chose Ohio and the reason we're taking this approach is several of the students were from Ohio and they wanted to do it about their home state. They cared deeply about that. And also Ohio has really good open data actually. So it was nice to do. And it also has some infamously, supposedly gerrymandered districts, particularly the 9th, which you may know as the snake on the lake. And so we did, this is actually centroid points of every census block in Ohio, distance travel to all of them. So it ends up being, I think, 84 million computations. Again, this is where that nice funding from Microsoft was helpful because they gave us some Azure resources and we could do the entire state in about 11 hours. Previously on the machines that I owned, it was estimated to take 45 days, which wasn't really great. But if you look at that, you can immediately see that, I wish I could walk over and point, but you can see that Ohio starts getting pulled together. And that's because there's highways that make travel north-south across Ohio much more quickly. This is a map of Ohio's congressional districts where you minimize travel time between all of the points. So all of these points are closer to all of their other points. This is a 11-dimensional MDS because that's where the stress curve fell. If you're really into sort of algorithmic clustering approaches, we can talk after, but they get kind of mathy pretty fast, and I thought I'd skip you that. Doesn't it look really satisfying? Right? It's like, wow, that looks nice. Unfortunately, these are the current congressional districts laid really quickly over them, and you can see that mess up along the water. That's the snake on the lake because it looks a bit like a snake. But what is actually interesting about this approach is that you maintain something narrow along the lake. It doesn't fully go away. It's no longer the snake, but it implies that there is, of course, some ability to travel back and forth and across of that district. And the reason, of course, is because there's ferry service up there. And there's also a road, Route 2 goes along that. Now, the neat thing that I have to tell you about this is, and you might have been able to guess, this is not balanced for population in any way, which doesn't actually work for congressional representation. So the next part of the process was trying to find a way that would actually be balanced within certain thresholds that are required by the state constitution for representation. And we actually got there, and it looks like this. Sorry about the colors. These were screenshots, but I learned the other day that screenshots are the best way to map anyway, so I'm going to take away. I don't feel bad. This ends up, these are actually populations are within the current thresholds. So we looked at the largest and smallest of the current districts, and everything falls within that. So this could be a congressional districting plan of Ohio that emphasizes the ability to travel within, across, and through your districts. And so here, okay, this is like my last slide, and this is just something that one of my students sent me the other day. In addition to drawing maps, right, which is always fun and super great, we can also use this method to analyze the current districts. And what we can actually do is a slightly different approach, where we take our distance matrix and then we can use local field outliers to look for outliers. And these are places that are particularly hard to either get to or to get out of from your district. And what's neat about this approach is those areas might actually be, if you're looking cartographically, just the lines on a map, they could appear quite central. But they're places that aren't really connected by estimated travel time to the rest of the districts. And what we find here is that, and the reason that this matters is if you're following electoral districting, you might be aware of the Rucho decision, which is that partisan gerrymandering is not justiciable on the federal level. However, racial gerrymandering is, because in the words of our current Chief Justice, racism is something that we can agree as a society we want to get rid of, but partisan difference isn't. Now, whether you actually believe he believes that or not is irrelevant, because that is in the majority's opinion. So what we can actually do is we can look for those outliers, those areas that are not well connected to the rest of the district, even if they might look like they are on the map. And we can check census demographic data to see how they stack up to other areas. And what you actually find in the current map is that there's a lot of areas that are extremely rural and extremely white that appear to get tacked on to other districts to shift the representation there. And so I'll leave you with some thoughts there. I'm happy to talk about the technical approach here, but I know that some other speakers have run up to the time limit, and I want to get questions for everybody at the end. So I'm happy to talk to more, and the one thing I will say is that if you are an undergrad, you should come and talk to me and perhaps apply if you're interested in this district, or if you happen to advise or know some undergrads, because you get to live in this beautiful old house, you get to work with maps and like digital computation for 8 weeks, and I pay you. Thank you.